Okay, welcome back. And so we're wrapping up our lecture on painting for Unit 5. And I want to remind you that we will be covering a bunch of other art media in painting when we get to Unit 6. But for right now, we're going to be talking about tempera painting. A lot of the painting that we saw in the early Renaissance, like Castuccio, and some of the paintings we saw by Giotto, a lot of the early paintings were tempera paintings. And also in the middle part and up to the high Renaissance, we saw a lot of paintings where they were painted in tempera, but then with oils on top. So, what is tempera painting? Tempera painting is where the medium is egg yolk and not the egg white, as a lot of people would think, but you separate the white and the yolk, and you use the yolk and you mix that with your pigment, and that makes a paint. And one of the interesting things about tempera painting is that because of the specific properties of lipids, fats in eggs, it actually can mix both with like a water-based medium, like literally you could thin it down like watercolor, but you could also add oil to it, so that tempera could be used in early stages thinned down like a watercolor, and then at later stages become more like kind of like an oil stained varnish. So that's an interesting thing about tempera painting. But another thing about tempera is that it dries pretty fast, and so it kind of like it really is not useful, or it doesn't work very well for putting down large areas of color, really and really big strokes, or and it's not lends itself well for blending. So instead, the artists have to learn how to basically to hatch very carefully with tempera, and you can see that in although it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that in these older paintings, and you can see that in this painting by Andrew Wyeth. And Andrew Wyeth, by the way, is the son of N.C. Wyeth, who I think we talked about in an earlier lecture just a little bit. And one of the things that's important to know from that is that that kind of learning to paint by hatching light marks and dark marks and warm colors and cool colors back and forth into each other, that becomes a really important part of how most of Western painting is designed. I mean, we don't necessarily see it unless we're looking at it up close. But when we're looking at the painting, the oil paintings of the Baroque, a lot of the really careful modeling is done that way, where it's just these thin marks layered back and forth. Of course, when you're doing it in oil painting, it can be a little bit more wet into wet, a little bit looser, and it can be in more thinner layers, more transparent. But nonetheless, it's very similar. You know, the techniques kind of built one into the other. So here's some examples of tempera painting in contemporary art. I'm a really big fan of Andrew Grassi, um, and he does these paintings that are these very, very careful photo-based paintings, and he very often focuses on the art world and museum and gallery presentation as kind of the subject matter of what he wants to focus on. And there's something very kind of thoughtful and I don't know, like a restrained, ironic wit, where um, they're both their commentary on the contemporary art world as he's pursuing a very kind of almost anti-contemporary aesthetic himself, which I think is kind of interesting. So the last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is just how how important tempera was leading to the development of oil painting. And it's not we'll talk more about this when we have when we have a discussion of oil painting, but the main point I want to get here across is that this was a kind of a transition period. A lot of times people will credit Jan van Eyck over here and say he's the inventor of oil painting, and that may be true, but we don't know that for certain. What we do know is that in his lifetime and in the region where he lived, and he was definitely probably the most dominant painter, that that tempera painting pretty much transitioned into oil painting. And that transition started with people making paintings where they put the foundation colors, they did almost all the painting in tempera, and then they varnished it with oil. And then they started to like add a little bit of tempera paint to the oil varnish, right? To color it in different ways, to maybe be able to make the reds, these kind of scarlet, red, orange reds on that dress, to make them more saturated. And, or, here in this um, headcloth. And and through that, they started to realize that they could get more and more color when the color was embedded in oil. And at some point, someone figured out that you could skip the tempera issue entirely and just basically mix the pigment with the oil. But you can't just mix it; you have to grind it into the oil. That was the important thing, and someone figured that out. Whether that was Jan van Eyck or his brother or somebody else, we will never know for certain. But it definitely happened at this period, at this point, and its impact was going to be huge. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in some other lectures. Um, and lastly, I just want to end on this Jan van Eyck, the Alfini wedding portrait, which we'll talk about in a couple of different lectures. But right now, I just want to point out its kind of iconic status of how all the different people who have made art sort of based off of it. All right, that's the end of the lecture. I will see you next when we talk about balance and color.